Just before midnight on the 14th of March 44 BC, three men were sitting around a table in a private villa in Rome. They were supposed to be planning for an upcoming campaign on the east of the Roman frontier, but after much discussion and a little too much wine, the conversation had turned away from warfare and towards something more speculative and personal. The question was raised: what would be the best way to die? Two of the men, Lepidus and Decimus, waited patiently while their esteemed guest thought of his answer. After a brief stare into his cup of wine, the most powerful man in the known world, Julius Caesar, leaned forward to share his thoughts. The best way to die would be suddenly, and surrounded by friends. Lepidus, a military man, was impressed with this soldierly answer, but Decimus was broken to hear that this man, the ruler of Rome and a loved personal friend, was to have his wish granted the very next morning. Unknown to the other two men in the room, Decimus had spent the last 6 months as part of a determined conspiracy to assassinate Caesar during a Senate meeting, and tomorrow was the big day. Julius Caesar was immensely popular amongst the Roman people, but to the ruling elite, his meteoric rise to power and subsequent reforms of the Roman constitution were seen as a threat to the republican ideals that nearly all Roman politicians considered sacred. In normal times, the Roman political system would have been able to deal with the threat that Caesar posed, but these were not normal times, and Caesar was anything but a normal man. 6 years before any of this went down, Julius Caesar and a man named Pompey were the two top dogs in the Roman Republic, and although for most of their relationship Pompey had been the stronger of the two, by the year 50 BC the winds were changing after Caesar had made himself monstrously rich and overwhelmingly popular in the aftermath of his conquests in Gaul, in modern-day France. Pompey and many of the other senior statesmen became anxious that not only was this up-and-coming Caesar threatening the balance of power within Rome, but was also showing a troubling disrespect for Roman law and an ever-increasing hunger for more power. A disagreement then arose between Caesar and the Senate about whether or not his term as consul had expired. A consul was sort of like Rome's equivalent of a president, except there were two consuls instead of just the one president. But other than that, they were similar, with set terms of office, special powers to pass and propose laws, conduct military campaigns, and enjoy legal immunity while in office. Pompey and his conservative allies in the Senate argued that Caesar's term was over and it was time for him to give up his power and return to Rome. Caesar argued that he had more time and that this was nothing but a political move to try and deny him his glory in Gaul and strip him of his legal immunity so they could drag him through the courts. On the 7th of January 49 BC, after much political bickering and failed compromises, the Roman Senate, backed by military support from Pompey, declared Caesar a rogue, actor, and an enemy of the state. Caesar responded by marching his army down from Gaul and into Italy, famously crossing the Rubicon on the 10th or 11th of that same month. Marching an army into Italy was very illegal, and through this act alone, Caesar instantly ignited a civil war. For an individual named Brutus, who will become very important later in this video, the start of the war meant that he was left with an impossible decision to make. On the one hand, he was a sensitive, intellectual thinker who respected Rome's institutions and Roman law and disagreed profoundly with Caesar's appetite for power and his march on Rome. On the other hand, Julius Caesar was basically family to Brutus. His mother, Servilia, was a long-time romantic lover with Caesar, and for most of Brutus's life, he would look to Caesar as a father figure who skyrocketed his career within the Roman system. After some agonizing deliberation, Brutus decided that his loyalty to Rome came before his loyalty to Caesar and joined the Pompeian faction in defense of Rome's political institutions. It's a decision that will ring through the entirety of this story. Pompey had the support of the Senate, a reputation for incredible military prowess, and enormous financial backing. Many believed it was a matter of time until he squashed Caesar's rebellion. But he didn't. Instead, during the Battle of Pharsalus on the 9th of August 48 BC, his forces were crushed by Caesar's smaller army, and he was forced to flee to Egypt, where he was eventually killed. With his primary opponent vanquished, Caesar made a big show of forgiving anybody who had surrendered after taking arms against him, including his almost son-in-law Brutus, and also a man named Cassius, a skilled general who fought under Pompey's flag. He then spent the next 3 years stomping around the Med, snuffing out the last of his political opponents and expanding Rome's influence over the region, including his meeting and subsequent affair with Queen Cleopatra of Egypt. By the summer of 45 BC, Caesar felt that both his own position and the Republic's geopolitical position was strong enough that he could head home. He returned to Rome in October of that year and started cracking on with some domestic reforms, showering himself with new honours and privileges and concentrating power into his own hands. Some of his reforms were direly needed, it must be admitted, such as changing the Roman calendar to a new system that didn't need to be manually adjusted every year. The old one had 355 days in a year, and of course there are 365 days in a year, but this is still Julius Caesar we're talking about, and even mundane reforms like calendars and timekeeping weren't spared his ego, with him inserting a month entirely for himself, July, and also proposing laws to make his own birthday, the 12th of July, a public holiday. Many of the ex-Pompeians who'd survived the war and then been forgiven by Caesar saw these changes with alarm and disgust. But he was the top dog now, and there was little they could do without radical action. As more and more political powers were heaped onto Caesar personally, he also started to take on some symbolic privileges, such as the right to wear the kind of clothes that kings would wear and sit on a golden throne in the Senate. Even to regular citizens, this was pretty unusual stuff. Whether or not Caesar was the most popular man in the Roman Republic, it was still the Roman Republic, and the whole thing about republics is that they don't do kings. One of the cornerstones of Roman political tradition and identity was that they would never again suffer a monarch, since they binned off their last king in 509 BC, nearly half a millennia ago. Now, even Caesar's own supporters in the Senate were beginning to wonder if they'd bet on the wrong horse, including one man, Decimus, a close friend and ally of Caesar who had fought with him since his days back in Gaul. Then, in February 44 BC, Caesar had himself titled Dictator for Life, which was technically impossible according to Roman political tradition and law. The Romans didn't use the word dictator in the same negative way that we use it today, and it was common for consuls to be given dictatorial powers in times of crises. But dictators were supposed to be given unlimited power for a limited time to deal with a defined crisis. But having these powers for life without having an emergency to deal with meant that most Romans were able to see this for what it was. Another king, just this time without a crown. But for Caesar, the crown was soon to follow. On the 15th of February 44 BC, during the Lupercalia celebrations, a stunt was orchestrated between Caesar and his right-hand man, Mark Antony. In front of the crowd, Antony presented Caesar with a crown. The audience suddenly fell silent and watched with bated breath. To their relief, Caesar declined the crown, but the stunt was repeated another 3 times until Antony finally relented. Historians are conflicted on what to make of this. Some argue that Caesar was trying to show the public that he wasn't a king and that he would never accept a crown. Others say, and I'm inclined to agree here, that Caesar was using the stunt to get a feel for the public mood and test the waters. If the crowd had erupted into thunderous applause, I think he would have gladly taken the crown upon his head. For what was left of Rome's political establishment, all of this was a step too far. Brutus, the man who looked to Caesar like a father, who had stood against him and had then been forgiven, felt that he now had no option but to stand against Caesar a second time. But before he had the opportunity to come up with any plan of action, he was approached by two men of similar conviction, Decimus and Cassius. It turns out that, unbeknownst to Brutus, since the summer of that last year, there had been an enormous 60-man strong underground conspiracy to stop Caesar, and Brutus was the missing piece in their plan. It wasn't that Brutus was a particularly astute philosopher or intelligent political thinker or popular figure, and it also wasn't that Brutus's close relationship with Caesar allowed him access by which to make a move. It was none of that. All the conspirators wanted from Brutus was his name. See, according to Roman folklore, it was the ancestor of Brutus, a man named Lucius Junius Brutus, who had successfully led the revolt against the last tyrant king of Rome and forever banished the monarchy from the city, laying the foundations for a glorious republic that was now once again under threat. The symbol of another Brutus holding the blade to another tyrant was too powerful to ignore. But although Brutus was brought into the plot for his prestigious name, he quickly sidelined Cassius and Decimus and became the intellectual and moral leader of this new conspiracy to rid Rome of its emerging king. When he joined the conspiracy meetings, he found that the only thing the conspirators had in common was their hatred of Caesar, but no real plan for how to off him and no real thought for what would happen in the aftermath. Brutus gave shape to their ambition and a solid plan forward that all of the plotters could agree on. For starters, it was recommended that this murder be expressly political. They were murdering the tyrant, not the man. For this reason, it had to be done in public and in full view of the people, sending a message that it was an honourable act for the people of Rome to be proud of. Poisoning the dictator or strangling him in the night would send completely the wrong message. This then led to a series of debates about how to actually execute the plot, with some suggesting that he be stabbed in public during an election, thrown off a bridge while on parade, or ambushed by a squad of gladiators. All of these plans proved to be impossible or inappropriate, until it was suggested that they could ambush Caesar during a meeting at the Senate. This would mean that the assassination would still be public, but that they wouldn't have to deal with a raging mob or a team of professional bodyguards. It was decided that it should take place on the 15th of March, 44 BC, the last scheduled Senate meeting before the tyrant King Caesar set off on another campaign in the east. And so we find ourselves back at that table in Lepidus's villa on March the 14th, with a drunk Caesar telling his supposed friend Decimus that he would prefer to die suddenly and surrounded by his friends, and Decimus silently considering the grim reality that Caesar's wish would be shortly honoured. We don't know how long the meeting went on after this final remark, but we can imagine the very different thoughts racing through Caesar and Decimus's minds as they both stumbled home after too much wine. One dreaming of his glorious campaign in the east, the other considering the fact that tomorrow morning he'll have to kill his friend of nearly 20 years. Caesar was awoken suddenly in the early hours of that morning, interrupted from his drunken slumber by his wife, Calpurnia, who herself had screamed herself awake in the middle of a nightmare. Calpurnia was inconsolable and sobbed to her husband that she'd endured such a vivid dream of watching their house burn and collapse around Caesar, trapping him to die inside. Other sources quote that she was holding his broken corpse as he bled onto her lap. Neither Caesar nor Calpurnia believed in omens, but he knew that she was plugged closely into political gossip and had potentially had this dream as a subconscious warning that something wasn't quite right. She begged him not to go to the Senate meeting that day, and Caesar, possibly quite hungover from the previous night, agreed that he should stay at home and recover in order to be ready for his campaign in the east. He sent his right-hand man, Mark Antony, to head to the Senate and dismiss the assembly, since Caesar wasn't feeling well. To the conspirators, this was a fatal development. This was the last Senate meeting before Caesar took off for the east, and there was no way that 60 people would be able to hold the plot a secret until Caesar returned. If he left Rome alive, he would eventually find out, and then all of the conspirators would be as good as dead. Decimus, who of all the men had the closest relationship with Caesar, decided to go to his house and convince him to come to the Senate meeting. When Caesar explained to Decimus that he and his wife had been unable to sleep and he was feeling a bit nervous after her terrifying nightmares, Decimus asked him, "Will someone of your stature pay attention to a woman's dreams and fool's omens?" This was enough to convince Caesar that he should attend the meeting. Because of this flip-flopping, Caesar had arrived to the Senate later than expected, and most of the senators were kind of hanging around outside the building, waiting for the meeting to start. When Caesar arrived, they began to file in, and despite the hiccups, the plan was now back on. The assassination began when one of the conspirators, named Simba, approached Caesar to ask him if he would consider allowing his exiled brother to return to Rome. Caesar flatly refused. And then Simba grabbed him, which was a signal to the others to attack. Due to some of the religious and domestic reforms that Caesar had passed as dictator, his body was now sacrosanct, meaning that touching him in public without permission was now not just a crime, but blasphemy. And here Simba was, not just touching him, but physically wrestling with him and pulling him by his toga. Caesar, both stunned by Simba's stupidity and furious at his impudence, cried to him, "This is violence." That was an understatement. While Simba was grappling with Caesar, another conspirator named Casca came from behind with a dagger raised above his head and drove the blade down onto the dictator's throat. He missed, and instead merely struck his shoulder. Caesar then turned to scrap it out with Casca, at which point he shouted, "Brother, help me." This cry was enough to shake the other conspirators to action, and they descended onto him in a frenzy of pushing and stabbing. Another Casca managed to sink a blade between the dictator's ribs. Pompey's old general Cassius delivered a nasty slash across his face. Decimus delivered a deep gash to his thigh. As the men pushed against one another to get a shot onto Caesar, fellow conspirators found themselves with unintended cuts and stabs to the hand as a whirlwind of sharpened steel and frenzied violence tore through the Senate floor. By the time Caesar fell to the ground, he had endured 23 separate wounds. Sources clash on his final words. Plutarch claims he said nothing and simply pulled his toga over his face before dying of blood loss. Cassius Dio writes that his final words were in Greek, "kaisouteknon," meaning "and you, my child," most commonly thought to be directed at his lover's son, Brutus, but recent scholars believe this may have actually been to Decimus, whom Caesar trusted far more and had a far closer relationship with. There are also some sources and translators who say that his final words may have actually been something closer to, "I'll see you in hell, punk." In any case, the conspirators had slain the tyrant, and Caesar lay dead on the Senate floor. In a twist of fate, he died directly under a statue of his old adversary, Pompey. Public perception of Caesar's murder was not popular. Many ordinary citizens simply acknowledged the news with grim disappointment and ran to their houses to lock up the doors in anticipation of the bloodbath that was surely to follow. Although there wasn't a bloodbath, at least not just yet, the conspirators had failed to secure peace or even a republic for Rome. When Caesar's will was opened, he had named an heir to his name and all his assets, his nephew, Octavian. If, by the way, Octavian had been dead at the time of opening, the second name on the list was none other than Decimus, the same man who had shared drinks with Caesar that very night before his death. But Octavian, who was very much alive when Caesar's will was opened, would rise to crush Caesar's assassins and complete his uncle's project of turning Rome from a republic to an empire.